Hi, and welcome to this webinar focusing on deceleration abilities. It's a webinar especially designed for you who are working with the physical development of elite football players. Nevertheless, it could also be of interest to you who are a physiotherapist or a strength and conditioning coach in any other sport as well. The topic of deceleration is currently on everyone's lips within the football industry, and we understand that the ability to decelerate has a significant impact in an increase in game pace and high pressing tactics. There are also strong assumptions about the correlation between, for example, ACL injuries and deceleration abilities that we're also going to address today. My name is Helena Andersson. I'm a researcher and a senior lecturer at Umeå University in Sweden, and I have previously worked as a sports scientist and fitness coach for the Swedish and US women national teams, to name a few. Photon Sport has, in close collaboration with independent experts and elite clubs in Germany and England, developed two new tests focusing on measuring and developing deceleration abilities in an isolated manner. In this webinar, divided into two chapters, you will first hear two well-known experts in the sports science field, Bram Swinnen, high-performance coach and founder of the Bram-Swinnen method, and Thomas DeSantos, a PhD in sport biomechanics and a senior lecturer at the Manchester Metropolitan University. They will discuss the importance of measuring and developing deceleration abilities in football, as well as any potential correlations between deceleration and knee injuries. The webinar will be wrapped up with a short product demonstration of our acceleration-deceleration ability test performed at one of Bram's courses in performance and rehab. It will be demonstrated by Michael Almebäck from Photon Sports together with Bram, so stick with us until the end. This webinar is going to last around 30 minutes, and we hope that you will be inspired in your work with these abilities and that you will find this relevant. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to the team of Photon Sports. And let's get started.
And that's an easy question. I think almost all sports are deceleration dominant. We work so much on acceleration, and acceleration of course is important, but if you look at football, rugby, a lot of different sports, most sports are deceleration dominant, and also most injuries, non-contact injuries, they occur during the deceleration phase. It's what also is called the forgotten factor.
Okay, yeah, great question. So I think a lot of emphasis has been placed on linear speed recently, probably over the last 15, 20 years, and with the advancements in technology. However, you need to be able to slow down your athlete and reduce your momentum, especially as you get faster. It becomes more challenging with the increased momentum. So I suppose deceleration is important in two scenarios. You've got deceleration as an isolated action itself, so reducing your horizontal momentum. If you take a footballer, for example, they might need to just decelerate in reaction to their opponent or in light of a pass or something like that. There's a lot of kind of tactical scenarios where deceleration is highly important as an isolated agility action. But it's also essential for reducing momentum prior to change of direction actions as well, typically for your sharper change of directions, normally around about 60 degrees and above. So it's really essential that you are breaking over a series of steps prior to you performing that change of direction. Yeah, so I'm a Dr. Thomas DeSantos, or Tom DeSantos. I'm normally used on social media. I'm a senior lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University in the United Kingdom in England. I did my PhD looking at change of direction biomechanics, so performance and injury risk, and I'm also interested in ACL injury mitigation and screening tools and strategies to try and prevent and mitigate these injuries. In addition to that, I'm a physical performance coach with the England Football Association, working with their para football squad.
My name is Bram Swinnen. I'm a physical therapist and performance coach. I already worked for 25 years at the highest level in basketball, football, track and field and tennis. For the moment I work as a consultant also at Genk, the first division team. I also give courses with my team, so integrated performance training, and internationally we do performance and rehab courses. Over those 25 years, I progressively started dedicating a bigger part of my training to eccentric training and also deceleration. In the beginning, eccentrics was considered as all training. It was something that you didn't implement, certainly not in the season, because it gave a lot of muscle soreness. But basically, that's all been debunked by research, and you have a really high effectiveness from eccentric training. And I progressively started implementing more eccentrics and deceleration training.
In addition to the importance for performance, they're also an injury inciting mechanism, an event. So there's been quite a few studies now highlighting that these deceleration actions and change of direction actions are associated with various injuries. So ACL being one of the primary mechanisms of injury. It's drawn a lot of media attention recently, particularly in female soccer. So typically they occur during a lot of pressing and defensive scenarios where you may need to accelerate and then slam on the brakes once you start pressing an opponent when they have the ball, and they might try and shift and change direction with the ball, or you're trying to make some form of interception. So chronic exposure to excessive bouts of decelerations, high intensity actions without adequate rest and recovery can also lead to some chronic potential muscle damage issues or knee joint health issues, maybe patellofemoral pain or Achilles tendinopathy and so on. So that monitoring, not only from a performance perspective, but the injury mitigation perspective and overuse injuries is also really important as well.
So to test deceleration, we use the photon sports. So you can have an acceleration phase over 5, 10, or increase even to 20 meters that you go to full speed sprint, and then decelerate as fast as possible. And then you calculate how much distance you need to decelerate. But you can also even between the force display on the ultimate and penultimate steps. So there are a lot of parameters in photon sports, and we use those as testing and testing parameters.
So there's various bits of technology to assess deceleration abilities. There's probably two primary tests where you either accelerate and sprint and then decelerate at a specific distance. So it might be decelerate, and once you get to 20 meters, you're going to decelerate on that cone specifically. Or it may be you sprint a certain distance. Once you've passed that point, you then slam on the brakes. So you've got the classic test by Damien Harper, the ADA test, where you sprint 20 meters. Once you cross that point, you then slam on the brakes, and then you can record various metrics. So in terms of technology that we can use, so obviously you got photon, you've got radar technology, LiDAR technology, optoelectronic technology, potentially GPS, although I'm dubious about the sampling rate of GPS. The beauty of the other bits of technology, I believe photon samples at 60 hertz. GPS typically is 10 hertz, which I don't think is enough to actually capture enough data because decelerations occur over potentially a fraction of a second. There are some GPS systems that are sampling at greater frequencies, 18, potentially 50 hertz as well. And then you've got kind of crude measures of just tape distance measures as well. But what we seem to find, and some of the research shows, is if you do go with the approach where you sprint a certain distance, then slam on the brakes once you cross that point, athletes tend to brake before the point. So if you use a tape measure, you'd be getting an underrepresentation of their true deceleration. So I would go for something that does provide instantaneous measures of velocity and position. So photon's a great example.
What I used before is, of course, you have eccentric strength. You have also fast eccentric loading. The testing itself was more on an elementary level and still a good testing, but I have to admit, not sport specific enough.
Integrate deceleration assessments as part of a change of direction assessment. So as part of the 505, you would run typically 15 meters, turn at that 15 meter mark, 180 degrees, and come back. So you would need to reduce your momentum to zero. That would probably be more of a test where you are just decelerating at that specific distance. So you could get a 2-for-1 kind of test. You're assessing change of direction ability or 180-degree change of direction ability. But if you have got access to technology such as photon or any other bit of technology that gives you instantaneous velocity, you can start breaking down that 505 into different phases.
We test as much as possible. So every time, we work with sensors during strength. So Smart Coach or Output Sports for acceleration, average speed, peak power. We gather everything we can gather. If you talk about deceleration, so an eccentric strength, their fast eccentric loading, ground reaction forces, peak power output, we gather those. And of course, more sport-specific exercises like the deceleration phase we test with photon sports. So we implement everything into training, so we also have more regular testing.
For my guys, I probably want to do it quite consistently and often. I suppose it comes down to like resources, logistics, and your head coach, how much time they're going to give you to do the testing, and the time of the year. Normally, if you were in a football club, they probably would have periodic testing every maybe 3 or 4 times a year. So maybe start off a pre-season period. I probably wouldn't do it on day one, going into maximal velocity sprints and high intensity decels. But after a few weeks, once they build up that capacity, probably some point in pre-season, end of pre-season, mid-season, and towards the end of the season. I suppose it depends. If you've identified if specific players need to work on deceleration abilities, you might put an intervention in place and monitor it every 4 to 8 weeks. In terms of the trainability of these qualities, there isn't too many deceleration focused intervention studies. I've done some change of direction studies, and we've been able to find we can promote quite rapid changes in as little as 6 weeks. So I reckon if you were to really inform and drive and target this with your training, probably a 6 to 8 week period would be good if you're going to really implement some sort of like deceleration or eccentric based or isometric based intervention. I would argue it's negligent to not be evaluating deceleration capabilities of your athletes if your sport involves multi-directional movements and deceleration movements. I think there are a lot of solutions available now, and we should be doing it periodically over the course of the season, because we've got a duty of care to make sure athletes are physically prepared for the demands of their sport. If you're not evaluating deceleration capabilities, how do you know that they're capable of meeting the demands of the sport? So in terms of the key metrics, so you can measure obviously your peak deceleration values, but essentially you want to have little stopping distance and do that in as short amount of time as possible. So being able to brake hard, late and fast. If you think about in sport, you want to be able to outmaneuver your opponent and be able to slam on the brakes quickly over a short time interval and as little distance as possible to create separation or react to your opponent. So braking distance, time to stop, average of peak deceleration, approach velocity or momentum.
The distance of deceleration from full speed. So you have the distance, you have the balance in penultimate to ultimate step, and also the power output. So you have a lot of different KPIs. A lot of times, because they're photon sports, they also developed based on test of Damien Harper, who's a specialist in deceleration. So in some things, like in horizontal force profiling, I indicated to photon sports a few things that I want implemented. I think deceleration wise, I did that less, because also the tests there are developed based on specialists. Also, if we look at change of direction, so change of direction, what's very important, that's the horizontal force production during deceleration, during the penultimate and the ultimate step, contact times, and also of course horizontal force production, sprinting out of this change of direction. So I think we did horizontal force profiling. You can do that with photon sports. Maybe in deceleration, that would be also an interesting one, to have an idea on the horizontal forces that you produce during deceleration for sprinting. Now, if you see, for example, that players proportionally they need a lot more distance to decelerate, their landing impulse is lower. Yeah, of course, that means you have to focus a little bit more on eccentrics. Maybe just start with elementary exercises, then go to development, and then go to sport-specific exercises. But with athletes that have a proportionally longer distance to decelerate, their deceleration abilities are not as good, I would increase deceleration exercise or eccentric exercise, the proportion of eccentric exercise and deceleration in their training schedule.
I know it seems a bit of a cop-out answer, but it will depend. I suppose it comes down to logistics, resources, the amount of staff that you have. Ideally, we should be trying to drive individualized testing. However, I completely appreciate if you're the strength and conditioning coach and you've got 40 athletes to work with and you've only got 2 sessions per week of an hour each, it's going to be quite difficult to individualize everything. But where possible, individualize where possible. You could start putting people into buckets depending on their results. So I think the first step is looking at those KPIs, how well did those athletes perform, and then start identifying, do they exceed average, are they below average, based on where your normative data is or where they rank maybe within the squad. So
you also see that a lot of times, for example, after ACL, return to play on ACL, you have a lot of test batteries, but everything is like task specific. But the moment that dual tasks come into play, that decision making comes into play, that mechanics, deceleration mechanics or landing mechanics, that they deteriorate, they become worse. And that's also what we need to implement in rehab. We need to implement more dual task, because that's the way daily life, and especially sports, it's always a cognitive overload. I have to say, I also have very good feedback from the athletes I rehab or train, so that they really feel, I always explain also why we do something, and that they really feel okay for explosiveness and athletic ability, that they feel that really helps them.
yes, now great question. So I think we're in an exciting time where technology is continuously evolving and advancing. Really high pressure environments, particularly working in sports where time is precious. So I think everyone appreciates that testing is important, but you don't want to be spending days and days and hours trying to collect the data, but also you need to be able to act on that data and inform or drive interventions or discussions as part of your MDT. So invisible monitoring is one key aspect, so bits of technology that kind of encourage that element. You need, I suppose, sufficient testing protocols. So from myself using the photon technology previously, it seems to work very quick. You can probably test an athlete, a few trials in a few minutes. And if you have a bit of a carousel effect, or you can have multiple athletes training at the same time, it shouldn't take too much time. The key thing is getting data back. So yes, we've done this testing. What does that mean for the player? And then how well do you visualize that back to your key stakeholders of the player? Where do they need to work on? Where do they rank? Where are the strengths and areas of improvement?
I think the biggest advantage is that at this moment that we can implement testing into training. So before it was not possible because the setup was too complicated, it took too much time. And that's a big advantage of improved technology, that the testing doesn't interrupt the flow of the training. So every training session can be a testing session. I think that mind shift is coming a lot faster in the last 1 or 2 years. Because also what you see in research is the focus, the importance on movement strategy, not just performance. So, and also of course data gathering. We don't do only testing like for performance testing, but a lot of things we use what we call fatigue testing. So we want to have a good idea of the neuromuscular performance of the player and fatigue of the player. So we can adapt our program a little bit based on those results.
So we're basically going to do a normal sprint with a full-on break, so deceleration. And then we measure your deceleration abilities with 60 data points per second. So it's really simple, works like this. I press start, stand on the line,
Accelerate as maximal as possible and then brake. Brake as fast as possible. So you sprint to the cone. The moment you pass the cone, you brake as fast as possible. Okay?
And then we measure how long it takes for you to brake, your braking parameters in meters per second squared. So we pretty much get everything.
Yeah. You can see this as a testing, but this kind of work I always also implement in the performance training. Yeah? Remember that assisted braking, that's an important one. That high intensity braking forces, and that's also what you see with players that are not used to eccentrics and to braking. Yeah? Deceleration, at the end of the game, they avoid those high intensity decelerations. And that deteriorates performance, or like David says, yeah, you see them brake like a super tanker. Yeah? So that deteriorates performance and puts them at higher risk of injury. Okay? So you have more deceleration in the game than acceleration, especially high intensity. So it's also important that we train it. Okay? Still too much a forgotten factor, but we have to implement in training.
Hi again. I hope you found this webinar inspiring and relevant to your work in developing players' deceleration abilities, or if you're working preventively with, for example, knee injuries. With the newly developed 505 and ADA test, I hope that you also appreciate the opportunity to address players' deceleration abilities in the near future. These tests are now available in the latest version of the Photon Sports tablet app. If you would like to learn more about Photon Sports technology or test batteries in general, or deceleration testing in specific, please don't hesitate to reach out to the team from Photon Sports. Thank you for watching and good luck with your work.